If you take every single dollar that the US economy produced last year and then add 20%, that's the national debt right now. It is bigger than the entire economic output of the mightiest economy in the history of the world.
I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Light.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents.
I am absolutely thrilled today to be joined by William Glass. Laura's going to give a brief intro, and then we're going to jump right in. All right. Go ahead, Laura. So Will Glass is the communications director at the Millennial Debt Foundation based in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He heads up the In the Black license plate program, which is intriguing and very cool, as well as a podcast cleverly named Gross Domestic Problem. Makes me laugh every time. He leads a number of their other public outreach activities and some research. Prior to this, he had a decade of experience in brand building and e-commerce, and he also did a few political campaigns. So welcome, Will. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's the proverbial jack of all trades, master of none, sadly.
I think that's our theme song here. Maybe it's not for Laura, but I feel like that's my vibe as well.
Well, it's very interesting. The weird thing is I actually have advanced degrees in deep training and a bunch of stuff that is like only tangentially related to the stuff that I do every day. And that's always been true. My entire career has been like being good at stuff and then doing other stuff.
Doing something else. I think mine is like, I can see the through line. I don't know if anybody else that just kind of has, that's how it is.
Yes. Millennials especially were told while we were in college, find your passion. So what that translated to for some of us was find something you're really good at that makes you money and then do something else.
Do something else entirely. Yeah.
While still paying off the debt from the first thing.
That's right. Absolutely right.
Exactly.
So
find your passion at the cost of about $30,000 a year college tuition. Great plan. Well, I forgot to give the name. We Made This Political. I would love to jump in with Will, and my computer just turned off. Okay. The question I have is, I just want to sort of start with the elephant in the room. We have possible looming nuclear war with Iran, failures of liberal democratic norms, left, right, and center, polarization, political violence, chaos at the federal level. So with all of that going on, why would we be here today talking about the deficit and the national debt?
Yes. At the risk of turning myself into an internet meme, I kind of want to give you a tired, wired, and inspired version of this answer. The tired version is, well, everything that the federal government does, both well and badly, is paid for. And all parts of government policy are going to be fiscal policy, at least fiscal policy adjacent. Oftentimes when we're doing budget policy, we're actually doing other policy. We're fighting about what makes us a good society or what kind of people we want to be. The wired version is that for the last 5 days, I have been trying to write policy papers and been just like unbelievably distracted because like I'm also, I've got to find out whether Ted Cruz has given it back to Tucker Carlson yet or not, so so the wired version is, I don't know. I mean, sometimes other stuff is important for a minute, and it does seem like we're in a very crowded environment at the moment. That's kind of, I share that question sometimes, and it's my job to care about these things. And I still sometimes share that. Yeah, the budget matters, but I think a nuclear holocaust matters more and more urgently. So that's my wired version. And then my inspired version is that a lot of other social ills, pathologies, difficulties, struggles that we're having aren't immediately related to the prospect of near-term total destruction. And those policies are often, it's not just that government policy has to be paid for. Often what's happening is we're negotiating, we're fighting over an iceberg in the ocean. We're negotiating and fighting over the parts that we can see. Like, I want to claim it for this. You want to claim it for that. We both want to make sure our ship doesn't hit it. But it's but budget policy, fiscal policy, the national debt is the invisible part of the iceberg. Like it's the reason why the parts that are visible in the way that they are. So a lot of these things, erosion of democratic norms, increasing political polarization, all of these things, I don't want to go so far as to claim that they are themselves just the national debt in a different disguise, but they're definitely related to that. And we can go into some of that, how that actually works in terms of what's happening at the level of the national debt and the economy. But what a lot of people perceive to be a set of social problems that need discrete social solutions, the national debt is sort of a problem creating problem.
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues, I think. So a lot of these things are being driven by, well, care about the national debt. Why? Do you want to solve increasing political polarization? Do you want a more functional Congress and government and political system and economy? Do you want to do something in a lasting way about the perspective that a lot of people have that they're being increasingly left behind by the economy? If you care about those things, and more importantly, if you care about a solution that future-proofs those things, then the national debt is the thing to care about. I'll stop here. I kind of got into this idea. I kind of grew up in the era of imperial democracy building. There was a time, people will never imagine this now, but there was a time when military generals were actually important public figures. Not that long ago, when millennials were in our 20s and 30s, we actually knew the names of some of our generals and admirals, and we actually knew these people. People who watch West Wing would never understand this now. To be like, why is Fitz Wallace so important? Why do people even know who he is? One of them was Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the early part of the 2000s. When asked, what is the largest and most important national security threat that the United States faces, he would say over and over again, without blinking, the national debt.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes the unpart part of the iceberg is the actual part you really want to focus on.
That's really interesting, because that makes me think that in a lot of cases, we seem to have come to the conclusion that the solution to our problems is to tell people to be less polarized or more pluralistic.
Yeah.
And I think in almost every case, there's some underlying issue that's too messy for us to deal with and is counterintuitive. These are all knock-on effects of a bigger problem, which is the deficit or spending choices we're making and the impact of the deficit on consumer confidence right now.
Right. Yeah. These are also there. I don't want to say everybody who works in a political area, the temptation is to say that, like, hey, all of our politics would be fine if we would just all focus on the thing I want us to talk about. I'm not saying that.
Well, could you talk a little bit about this too? I didn't prep you for this, so I'm just going to throw it out there. I think a lot of the times people think if you're going to talk about the deficit, then the next thing you're going to say is we need to cut social spending, right? Safety nets are what need to go. We need austerity, and the things that are going to go are Medicaid, Medicare, entitlements, that sort of thing. Is that your perspective? Is that the approach that the Millennial Debt Foundation takes? And why or why not?
Yes, in fact, a lot of conversation around this, like when policymakers' eyes glaze over at the mention of the national debt, I think in general, what they see, and I understand this makes sense, I'm part of the problem here, but I think in general, people see, like, when you talk about the national debt, it's actually a fig leaf for some other policy agenda that you want to advance, but you want to create some moral authority around your policy agenda. I think this is definitely a both sides problem. It really depends on who's in power at any given time. So I think for me and for MDF, the answer to this question is mercenary. I'm for what works, because actually for me, the national debt is not a fig leaf for some other set of policy solutions. It actually is the iceberg that sinks the ship. The national debt right now sits at about $37 trillion. If you take every single dollar that the US economy produced last year and then add 20%, that's the national debt. It is bigger than the entire economic output of the mightiest economy in the history of the world. And it's only growing. The things that are driving its growth are entitlement spending around Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They are the things primarily driving the growth of the national debt. And over the next 30 years, of the $100 or so trillion that the US is already set to borrow by autopilot legislation that exists, nearly all of that spending is being driven by the growth in those entitlement programs. If you were to factor them out of the government, for just hypothetically as a thought experiment, the rest of the government runs at basically a small surplus.
Oh, wow.
So all of our defense spending, social welfare spending, things like SNAP, all of that runs at a moderate surplus. When you think about how inefficient the government can be, you think, my goodness, what must be the size of the albatross around our neck if we're able to take this unruly, unwieldy government and run it at a slight surplus? Basically, the entire deficit over the next 30 years is those programs. Whether you like those programs, whether you hate them, they are in desperate need of some kind of renegotiation. And that's to say nothing of the internal finances of those programs themselves, which we could talk about if you want. But basically, like this week, the trustees of those programs released reports that shouted fire in the theater of funding. And we'll see whether anybody listens.
Who is it that caused this the most predictable crisis in history? We see it coming. It keeps advancing. We're not doing anything about it.
It's not an iceberg in the middle of the night. There are people on it with giant signs saying steer away. We know how big it is. We actually know how big the portion under the water is. Like it's as if the drivers of the Titanic looked at it and said, yeah, let's just go for it. I think we could take it. I think we could probably outrun this thing if we're probably bigger. Like if they really thought God couldn't sink the ship, and they just said, okay, let's give it a shot. That's where we're at. We're taking a gamble that God can't sink the ship. And I think that's probably a very stupid gamble.
Yeah. I want to talk for a second about military spending. Laura and I talk a lot about human nature on this podcast. And there is something fundamentally human about this. I see it in the academic context all the time with pre-tenure faculty are like, how are the things that you need to do for tenure?
Right.
And they're like, well, I had to do all these other things. It's not that they don't see the iceberg. Humans are just really bad at long-term thinking and planning. And so unless you do a lot of really concrete long-term thinking and planning, you suck at it. And then you add in the fact that democracies in particular suck at long-term planning and thinking. Then you add in polarization. So like we're like taking human nature and like doubling and then tripling down on it. It's not surprising to me that we suck at this, but it is obviously a serious problem.
Yes, I think it's interesting because you're exactly right. I mean, having once been a PhD student, I can tell you that I was ready to talk about literally anything other than the research I was supposed to be doing now. It's just way more fun to talk about everything else. You want to talk about your research? Yes, I'm here for 2 hours. You want to talk about my research and the things I'm putting off because they're difficult and challenging and frustrating, then maybe I'll just run the other way and pretend we've never met. So I think there's definitely that side of it. With regards to the structural difficulties of democracies, they're extremely susceptible to collective action problems. One of the classic collective action problems is the freeloader paradox, where people are happy to receive benefits they didn't work for. We're incentivized to receive as many benefits as possible that we didn't work for. And so that incentivizes a kind of apathy among most people. Most people are rather politically apathetic, especially when it comes to fiscal policy. And that apathy is what allows a very small, motivated group of people to have a kind of tyrannical effect on things that do impact the rest of us. And as long as that impact can be put off long enough, will allow them to do it. And I think that sort of collective action problem is, it just makes it, this is what allows special interests to do what they do in our country and to get away with it. If we all knew, and if we had to feel the benefits today of the things that they're doing, we would all be like, there'd be pitchforks in the streets and maybe even more than pitchforks, but that's not the way it is. The phenomenon of sovereign debt allows us to put off the choices.
Yeah, I think especially where you kind of told people of our generation and we've accepted the idea that there will be no social security. We pay into it every paycheck, but there will be no social security by the time we reach retirement age. So I think there's sort of this learned helplessness where people have internalized the idea that, and I think about that because special interests are what are saying, well, nobody can talk about entitlement reform. It's a third rail. And what I've started to wonder is if all of us have already accepted that we're not going to see any of this money, it seems like if we did have a conversation, things could only get better, right? Because we can't get any worse than you paid into this thing your whole life, but you will never see a penny of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think this is what's so important about some of the work that you do, Laura, is that I basically see two currents making this more difficult than it seems like it ought to be. When you consider the fact that none of us expect to receive it anyway, the question is, why are we putting up with payroll taxes still being assessed to us every month forever? Like that, like it literally does kind of feel almost insane that we put up with this system. So why is that system still in place? I think one thing is the special interests who mobilize around this are the most effective lobbyists in the world. My newsfeed is now blowing up with people talking about the vast Jewish conspiracy to dominate the government. Whether or not people find that plausible or implausible, I think, hey, you think they're good at it, you should talk to the AARP. No one's ever been better at it ever than those guys are. One of the things they've done exceptionally well is they've said to people like me, yes, we're going to take payroll taxes from you every day for the rest of your life. The program's going to go bankrupt and you'll never see a dollar of it. But if you change it at all, it's because you actually just want to throw your own grandmother off of a cliff.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible messaging. I mean, I don't even have any living grandparents and I feel that, the exploitation of the basic human sympathies of good people to short circuit like a difficult political discussion. Okay, I'll hand it to them. Good job. But it is bankrupting the country. As we've been talking for 10 minutes about entitlements, I always feel like there needs to be a reset of the conversation, not because I don't want to talk about this, but because I want to remind people who just logged in here that when you hear me going on and on about the AARP, it isn't because I want to throw grandmother off the cliff. It's because the national debt, when it eats the economy, will throw everyone off the cliff.
Oh, that's a great point.
And the people who need government the most will suffer the most. I am borderline wealthy. And if you compare me to every generation of my family before me, I'm going to be fine. But the people who raised me, the people who, and I actually, if you'll permit a 2-second shameless plug, there's an episode of Gross Domestic Problem, my podcast, where a bunch of people who listen to the show said, why are you even doing this? And I did an episode where I basically told the national debt as it relates to my own biography, because when I grew up in a trailer park in Central Florida between a brothel on one side and a meth lab on the other before we were even good at cooking meth. I remember being a 12-year-old and being shocked awake in the middle of the night because the stupid meth cookers next door didn't know their ratios and they blew up that lab and it dented the trailer I lived in. This is the world I grew up in. Everybody I knew was on some kind of government benefit. Everybody I knew was a beneficiary either through disability or through Social Security or through early Medicare. And those people are the ones who will suffer the most. So whenever I hear somebody say, you can't hurt seniors, I'm like, what about everyone? What about literally everyone?
Yeah.
Is that a moral consideration worth weighing alongside the problems with entitlements?
Yeah.
And if it is, can we at least have the discussion without people feeling like their politicians are betraying some massive cultural mandate to never touch this thing? I feel this issue absolutely personally because of having grown up in a world where so many people would have starved and died if it weren't for the government programs that were available. It's my absolute focus on making sure that those things are available for people who need them. That forces me to say, I don't know, maybe somebody who makes $500,000 a year in passive investment income doesn't need a freaking Social Security check.
Yeah.
Maybe. Call me crazy, but maybe.
I think it's a conversation that we need to have. And you're right that one of the reasons we can't have that conversation is because there's special interest making sure that we have a very polarized version of that conversation. As with almost every issue that is polarizing the country now, there's a middle way between you can't touch it, or that if we sit down to talk about it, the end result will be elderly people starving and out in the street. There are a lot of paths to address this issue. The maximum number of paths available to us, the sooner we start.
Right,
Every day we wait, the runway gets shorter.
Yeah.
And I think this is absurd. Millennials especially are looking at a big chunk of every month's paycheck being gone, never to be recovered, and saying that money is the difference between having a second or third kid, or that money is me buying a bigger house or deciding that I can start a business. It has a real impact on drivers of the economy that would act right now.
Yeah, the scandal of this is that millennials are the most pro-tax generation in history. Never in history have there been people so willing to say, yes, the government can have 35% of what I work for to do something good with it. The question is what it takes for millennials to be upset about what their tax dollars are doing. That's how you know things are getting pretty bad. We were literally raised on images of oil-soaked seagulls from the Exxon Valdez, watching those images on television saying, whatever it takes, we're ready. And that's who we are. We're ready to do that. And then this very same group of people went through the 2008 financial crisis and watched like a bunch of like annoying speculators and irresponsible regulators team up to make hell happen in the US economy right as we were graduating college. And we still said, yeah, I'll pay my taxes. I want the government to help the people who need help. And then what's happened in the meantime is that we put our heads down for 10 years, had kids, grew careers, and then we all turned 40 and looked around and went, what the hell is happening here? What are we doing? What are you doing? By this point, I've paid something like $275,000 in taxes over the course of my life. What has it done? What it's done is further entrench, establish an incumbent special interest groups and not help anyone. Okay, I'm pretty pissed now.
Sorry, Cap. I would ask, and this is actually a genuinely curious question. I'm interested in the flipping of the formula because I legitimately do not know the answer to this question. You mentioned that if we got rid of entitlements, the rest of the government would. Is the same true? Like what proportion of military spending, if we kept entitlements? First of all, I just want to say that I am 100% in favor of entitlement reform. I love my parents. They're 75. They are lovely people. This is not like an argument to like put them on an iceberg, but they have a really nice 401k because they worked hard and of New York State pensions. Why do they need Social Security? Like these kinds of puzzles. They don't need Medicare probably. So anyway, this is not an argument against entitlement reform. But I'm wondering about where the military piece fits in. I ask this partially because there's been a lot of people. I'm from a military family. My husband just retired from the Army. My brother was a Marine. But both of them have stories of the military trying to cut costs and legislators saying, no, like we need to close these bases or we need to do this other thing. And legislators say, no, that would decimate this rural area or whatever. Or we need these giant things to keep somebody, whatever. So I'm curious about that piece too. It's possible that the numbers just are swamped by the entitlement spending. I'm just curious what the actual numbers are and whether there could be a double-edged kind of.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. And one of the reasons it's a fair question is whatever the numbers are, which we'll get to in a second, it is in fact the case that the politics of the budget over basically my entire lifetime have worked more or less like this. Democrats want to increase domestic spending on safety net programs or on various kinds of do-goodery that they get excited about. And that's, by the way, not to judge any of it. Some of it's really good. Obviously, some of it sucks, but that's just the way the government works. And the way that that gets paid for by people who have been extremely, quote unquote, hawkish on the budget, the way you buy those people off is by okaying some new area of military research or something like that. There's a sense where the budget politics of my lifetime have been, you can have your thing if I can have my thing. What ends up happening is twice the money gets spent. A very small percentage of the United States actually serves in the military, an alarmingly low number when you think about the nature of threats that the United States faces in the world. The cost of paying for everything we have to do in the military is dwarfed by the cost of providing 35 years of public benefit for the largest generation that's ever existed, most of whom are currently retiring at about 10,000 per day. So military spending in raw dollars over the last 20 years has grown, but military spending as a portion of GDP, when you're trying to compare apples to apples, that's one of the ways you might do it. If you take all of the entitlement programs and you compare them to GDP, they're growing faster than GDP. And if you compare military spending, it is decreasing relative to GDP. Now, as I said before, I'm fairly mercenary about this. This is what was so interesting to me about the Department of Government Efficiency. Good on you. Go for it. If you can find it and it sucks, let's do something about it. If there are duplicative roles or if we're spending on figuring out what the defense capabilities of homing pigeons are, fine, get rid of it. Like I'm happy to see it. It's not like to me, nothing is sacred. I think most people who are aware of it would say that the F-35 is a massive military boondoggle of a program.
I like it.
Well, people take off and lift.
Sure. VTOP, please.
I need you to go out on this limb a little bit because I've never had an argument with somebody where I took some piece of military spending and criticized it, especially when that thing was the F-35. So I really think you should go for this. I think I want to see a position paper on it too. Yeah.
Hold on.
So, don't get me wrong. It's a badass thing. It's just that it's a badass thing that costs way more than it should have. And a lot of that is because our processes for military procurement are so confusing and broken. Let's go. But all of this is really just
challenged anybody who had
That's true. But also, I mean, have you seen the F-22, Laura? I mean, we made it
good jet.
We made it way cheaper and it's badass. But if there are we're in a place where I don't think anything can be sacred. I don't think anything can be off the table. Everybody's sacred cows are going to have to get slaughtered in order for this to happen. So MDS policy recommendations, one of the biggest challenges about them is that there's something in them for everyone to hate.
You brought up Doge a minute ago, and I wanted to go back to that because I think one of the things that's so important to this larger conversation is the fact that the numbers we're talking about are so vast that most people cannot process numbers of the size. When you're talking about $1 billion and $1 trillion, it absolutely defies comprehension. So when Doge was coming out and saying we saved $1 billion and, here's, we're going to save, what was their initial promise? It was something like
$2 trillion was the initial idea.
Now we landed at 100 million or something.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it sounds like
it's so sad.
Of money. I know.
Yeah.
It sounds like vast amounts of money, and it's not. Somebody who speaks really eloquently on this is Representative Schweikert of Arizona.
Yeah.
He was putting it in terms of savings, slowing the rate of growth.
Yeah.
And he's saying, okay, if you save $1 billion, you've saved something like 6 minutes of spending. And don't quote me on the stats because I don't remember offhand. But when you frame it in those terms, I think it helps to reset to people. We're not even in the ballpark of making a dent on this. Doge is not in the ballpark. Even if it did what it claimed it would do.
Yeah.
We're not taking this seriously enough.
Yes. I think if Doge had been perfectly successful at what they set out to do, it still would have amounted to saving a rounding error,
it's rounding error
in the 30-year horizon of what our debt and deficit is likely. I mean, we're going to be by different guesses, depending on who you listen to and how they score these things dynamically. You're looking at 30 years from now, you're looking at somewhere between 150 and $180 trillion in debt, the U.S. being that far in debt. If you adjust for inflation, it will be somewhere between 2 and 3 times the size of the economy. Mm-hmm. The problem with this is there are countries that do run debts like that. Japan is something like 245% debt to GDP right now. People look at that and say, it's obvious that it'll be okay. But the world doesn't operate on Japanese currency as the reserve currency of the world. Our economy is supposed to be safe. In some ways it's not, but that's why the gold standard asset class is the U.S. 10-year treasury. Well, it was slowly degrading in certain ways, but when the world's leading economy runs a debt that irresponsible, who's to say what would happen? And what I thought Doge could be, no one's ever asked me enough about Doge to give me a chance to rant about this before, but what I genuinely hoped it would be, and we were working with several other organizations to try and help this happen. What I genuinely hoped it would be, it kind of what it was before Inauguration Day, where Elon's brain trust was going through different line items of the federal budget and holding stuff up and being like, is this good? When you're cleaning out the house after an old relative moves out or something, do you want to keep this? What even is this? Old coffee makers that ground like this, what is this relic? Are we really studying the excremental habits of small birds? Is that really a thing? And every time they looked at something, there's oh, what? Wait, we do what? And my hope had been that what that would do, and it worked. This is what's so crazy is that for the first couple months of Doge, it was working. Is that it would be a public opinion influencer that can counter the influence of our large lobbying groups and special interests, where they would say, the budget has some weird stuff in it, you guys, and I don't think any of you want this. And then eventually we would all go, okay, if that's the part of the budget that we can see, that's the part of the budget that people have to run on, either defend or attack to win office. And it is full of nonsense. What is the part of the budget that no one has to defend? what's in there? Actually, what could have happened is a big trust shifting exercise so that when eventually then somebody has the hard conversation with us, says, look, guys, there's no way to square this without looking at all of it, not just all the crazy stuff that is certainly, I mean, like Medicare Advantage upcoding. I have a whole episode of this with Mark Goldwine from CRFB of my podcast. It is a nightmare. It's you're talking about trillions of dollars per year in fraud, effectively fraud. And then all these arbitrary and ridiculous carve outs in the tax code that allow people for no apparent reason. What would have happened is by pointing out how many stupid things are in the parts of the budget we all agree on, we could have actually had a big consensus building exercise where we all go, this is dumb. The debt's a threat. We are all in a lot of trouble. Let's everybody decide to look at everything.
Right.
Because that's the reason that we're in the position we're in is because most of it doesn't get looked at.
Yeah. The Medicare upcoding one, I do some work in health policy. One of the things that scares me the most about Medicare and Medicaid is we know the numbers are scary, right? We spend now upwards of 20% of GDP on healthcare. Our healthcare costs are ballooning. Our outcomes are not good. We're providing very expensive garbage healthcare to very large numbers of people. Yeah. The problem with this is that it's a little too complicated. Put it on a t-shirt or like, it's not going to lead the revolution or anything. But part of what I get really deeply frustrated about, because I work in an area that looks at sort of small entrepreneurial, like bottom up kinds of medical providers, the incentives that are baked into Medicare and Medicaid, the kinds of structures that they create, actually centralize and corporatize medical care. So you have this really bullshit feedback loop where we've corporatized because we have this crap incentive loop, but now that we've corporatized healthcare, those lobbyists have even more power over Medicare and Medicaid reform. And so they're totally disincentivized from any kind of reform. But then they also are able to manipulate prices. We don't actually have prices in our healthcare system, but they're able to manipulate, what they're able to sort of pull from the government. Meanwhile, we are crowding out and destroying the innovative kinds of experimentation that we need in order to solve the healthcare crisis. The costs that you're looking at, I think, are deeply important, but that's not even the full reckoning. If you look at lost opportunities, lost employment, lost opportunities to lower cost while increasing quality of care, we have thousands of examples of that. And we can't do it because we shot ourselves in the foot with these really bloated, complex programs. And I like to joke, when I first started, so my last book was on, it's called The Medicalization, now that we're all just doing, everyone should just throw out some when I was doing research on that book and I was studying Medicaid and Medicare regulations, I had to go to healthcare lobbyists to ask them what the regulation meant, because someone with a PhD in political science cannot read the regulation and understand how it actually applies in the real world. And so that was eye-opening to me, the fact that I literally can't read the Medicare regs and get what they're saying. So anyway, talking about the debt is not just talking about the debt. It's talking about the way that these programs create deep perverse incentives that have very long tails, right? That create these really awful downstream effects. And we don't talk about those very often, but that's my complaint session.
I've talked about the 30-year debt bomb that we're currently loading with all our might. I think this is eventually getting to the part of the conversation where in general, people, once you point out the actual shape of the problem, everybody's shoulders slump and they get sad. They start looking at the table. And the question is is there any hope? One of the commenters has asked, Congress faces no bad incentives to fix the national debt as a political idea is so dumb. If you're going to run on this, basically what you want to say is, guys, I want you to pay the same or more taxes, and I want you to expect less. That's not a winning campaign. I've worked on a couple campaigns. There are people who've worked on way more than me who would probably say, I don't know if that's a good messaging strategy. But actually what it is what we have to do is put money that right now goes to getting things that voters like and put it to things that they don't ever see again. I mean, just think about someone mentioned that I think, we talked a little bit earlier about defense spending. Right now in 2024 and forever, we spent more. This is the thing that really radicalized Elon Musk on the national debt. In 2024, we spent more on interest on the debt than we spent on all defense spending. Like everything that we did, every single bullet, plane, soldier, bayonets, if we still buy bayonets, we probably don't. Every single F-35, all the research, every dollar that we spent in 2024, we spent that dollar and then some on interest.
Just interest. We are servicing the debt. And that's
like we are in a place where if we're not there right now, we're extremely close to the point where we are borrowing to pay interest. And it absolutely will happen within the next 10 years. There's not a question about that. That's going to happen no matter what anyone does. So then, like what people have to do, want to run on a responsibility campaign, is they have to say like, we need to divert funds from things that you like to things that you don't see. We have to, and that's the millennial. That's why we're making this pitch as an organization to millennials, because like, it's not just that it has to be done by somebody. Millennials will be in their peak earning years when the trust funds run out. The problem is coming to a theater near you, millennials, whether you like it or not. As I said before, we were raised on Fern Gully and Kenny Loggins writing songs about the environment. Our intellectual hardware is already primed for the idea of a slow motion disaster. We already expected to have to be the ones to put stuff right. And there's a generational possibility here to actually make political progress. I have more faith in Laura's ability to do that than in a lot of people who currently work in DC. But I think the other thing is to the point of healthcare. Part of the reason that this problem exists in its current size and scope is because it was a thing you could get rich creating. You could get rich creating this problem. You could build a massive 501c3 that pays, $10 million bonuses to its corporate executives, to its nonprofit executive team by doing this. It's very hard to expect our Congress to stand up against that kind of pressure. On the other hand, and I think this is where, if I can help everybody put their shoulders up a little bit and look at some things, the real question, I think this is where I really want to unlock the genius in your audience, is this is also a problem that somebody can get rich solving.
Okay.
And I honestly have a lot more hope in that solution than in the idea that Congress is suddenly going to pivot its incentives and become different. Now, I continue to work with and in Congress and be simultaneously a cheerleader and a thorn in sides and everything else. By the way, if any of your listeners are in DC, we're renting out a giant food truck and putting it on C Street next week to give out pork sandwiches to celebrate this pork-loaded tax bill that's working its way through the Senate. If anybody wants to know about that, you can go to freeporkgiveaway.com and see what we're doing, and just come get a pork barbecue sandwich from us. If either of you are in DC, we'd love to see you. It'll be 105 degrees next week because there's a huge heat wave. We'll just all be suffering together, but celebrating that there are people in economies who should serve pork and they're food trucks. And the people who shouldn't serve pork are Congress. I don't expect Congress to 180 anytime soon. I think we can nip and tuck. I think we can make progress. But the real thing is somebody has to be able to get rich solving a problem that lots of people got rich creating. That may feel cynical. It's just the way it works in an economy like ours. There are already people on it, but unleashing the power of the economy, both to grow GDP and also to help us cut costs in the most expensive parts of the things that the government buys. And there's nothing more pregnant with opportunity that I can see than healthcare.
Yeah.
Like if you can, cost cutters in healthcare, those guys are going to make billions of dollars. They're going to help society. There are just so few places in the world where you can get filthy freaking rich doing something that will save the world. And that's one of them. So I hope that they'll hear that and just march forward with that charge.
Well, I think it's important that what you're saying is not, we will solve this by having less and cutting away from the people who are most reliant on government programs. We can solve this through modernization and innovation. The roadblock to that is that entrenched interests and lobbyists and special interests are saying, no, you're not allowed to compete with us. We've made the rules so complicated that you can't possibly compete with us. And that sucks because we're spending vast sums of money to get crap health care. These guys set the rules the way they'd like them to be. And it could be so much better and more efficient.
Yeah. I think it's very unrealistic to think that Congress is going to be able to overcome that. I mean, which is not to say that there's nothing to be done in Congress. Otherwise, I feel like I would be wasting most of my time. The other hat that I wear is as an investor. And as an investor, I see what people can do. And there's a way in which I kind of love the brutality of the American economy in some ways. Like, if you suck, you don't deserve money. Like, that's what the economy says. If you suck, if you make a thing that nobody wants, then you have been irresponsible with resources and you don't deserve to have a company. And yes, there are incumbents in healthcare. Those incumbents have spent billions of dollars lobbying Congress and lobbying the executive branch to create a world in which they can thrive and other people can't. I don't think people should be intimidated by that. That has existed everywhere, always, for the history of the world. And yet the American economy has managed to produce people who disrupt and upset. If Congress can't do it, maybe some tycoons can. Help us with healthcare costs. Make it cheaper and simpler. Unleash the ingenuity of our best and smartest people to make this faster, cheaper, better, more effective. That can be done. Mm-hmm. And if it can be done, that's also a service for the world. It puts something new into the debt to GDP equation. We can cut costs and actually lower, even if Congress is completely feckless and doesn't touch spending in any of the places that it matters, it can be cheaper. Plus, you'll grow GDP and take that entire equation that keeps me up at night, which is debt to GDP. You can impact it from both sides. So I think that's a thing that, yes, I want people to be involved, and call your congressman, tell them that it's not okay for us to do what we're doing.
Yeah.
And at the same time, invest, put your money in wise places, find people who are actually making this, get up to speed on where the opportunities are in the economy for the world to be more efficient, for the things government buys to be more efficient, and interact with that economy by investing in it, by supporting it, and by consuming it.
Mm-hmm. Carol has a question, and I this was actually going to be sort of my hopeful piece. We do like to end on a kind of optimistic note. But one of the things, so Carol was asking about Amazon's medical care, and this kind of disruption is the thing that I'm the most excited about, which is funny because I actually am frustrated at the corporatization of healthcare that our current model has supported. But I think that the corporatization in a weird way is going to be the way out, because the sort of sectoralization of corporatization we've seen around hospitals and large insurance companies, Amazon is the only thing that's going to challenge that. Amazon's the only power that's going to be able to come in and tell the American Medical Association that they can't keep writing the regs to support their particular way of life. They were experimenting with clinics in their stores. I think there's a lot of benefits to that model because it loosens up the regulatory hold that the current power players have. Once you loosen that hold, there's going to be more opportunities for people to do things. I welcome some of these big corporate players in this space in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. That's where we can look for some hope. I also think there's some interesting like win-win spaces in the Social Security space. Congress will have to play a much larger role in that space. I'm interested in the appeals that Will was pointing to in terms of the things that millennials care about. I think if we offered people a transitional path with Social Security reform, it stays the way it is for this particular group of people, but then we start shifting. But we're shifting people toward maybe 401ks or other kinds of models where they're not losing things, but all not dependent on the government. Unstable government program. That's the issue. It's not about government dependence per se. It's just that program is not structured well. It's not structured well, and it can't keep up with demographic trends that we're looking at right now. The program was designed for a different period where far fewer retirees depended on far more current workers. That is no longer the circumstance. We are way upside down on that ratio. The life expectancy when Social Security was passed was 68 or 67. Like people were going to be on it for an average of 2 years. It was never set up for people to be on it for 25 years. And so that's one of the big, huge differences.
Absolutely.
Well,
all right,
I want to
get Will back.
but yeah, we will have a link in the show notes when this drops on Monday. We were joined by William Glass, who was absolutely fantastic. I love the passion. That was amazing. He's the host of the Gross Domestic Problem podcast, and we will link to that in the show notes. You can check out the Millennial Debt Foundation website. Any other resources? There's so many deficit resources. The other thing I'll put a plug for is the Debt Digest that Romina Bacha of Cato runs on Substack. It's very informative. It's very thoughtful. Millennial Debt Foundation and Cato's work in this area is a nonpartisan issue. I think we need more nonpartisan voters to keep pushing on this as a top issue. Yeah. We'll have links to your podcast and to the Millennial Debt Foundation website. Let us know if there's any others that you would like us to add. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really fun conversation. I had a blast. And we'll have all of your contact everything when we drop the episode, which will be on Monday morning. So thank you for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye.
You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us, too. Thanks for listening.